So what you basically need to know under this particular topic is basically what is debt capital, what is debt capital, what is debt capital, what is debt capital. Then you need to know something about the borrowing powers of the company, borrowing powers of the company. You need to understand something about debentures and types of debentures. What is a debenture and the types, debentures and types. Then you need to basically understand something about charges, 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 charges. We have two floating charges and fixed charges. What are floating charges and actually fixed charges? You need to understand something about crystallization of charges, crystallization of charges, crystallization of charges, crystallization of charges. Then you need to understand something about remedies of debenture holders, debenture holders, remedies of debenture holders, remedies of debenture holders. But in between here, of course, you learn something about the debenture holders register, debenture holders register, debenture holders register. Then also we'll actually also learn about, it's actually very key, distinction between debentures and shares. Distinction between debentures and shares. What is the difference between debentures and shares? Distinction between debentures and shares. Distinction between debentures and shares. So of course, under share capital, there's our previous chapter. We've learned that the company can actually be able to raise capital by being able to sell shares. So debt capital is actually also another way through which a company can actually be able to raise its capital or finance its activities. So when you talk about debt capital, it basically means now the company is actually borrowing. It's not selling shares, but it's basically borrowing, and basically through the borrowing, they are promising the investors who are actually lending money to the company, they pay them the principal amount plus interest. The principal amount plus interest. So how can the company be able to borrow? So they basically issue or give out an instrument known as a debenture. So basically when we talk about a debenture, we mean it's basically just a document that authenticates that an investor or basically the company is indebted to an investor, and the obligation of the company is to be able to pay the principal amount given by the investor plus some form of interest to this particular investor. So the company can actually be able to raise debt capital, do borrowing by being able to issue what are known as debentures. So of course, under share capital, we are saying the company is issuing shares. Under debt capital, it can actually be able to raise capital through borrowing by giving out what are known as debentures or selling what are known as debentures. When you talk about a debenture, it's basically a document authenticating or indicating that you as an investor, the company is actually owing you money. And the obligation under this particular document is basically for the company to be able to pay the principal amount plus some form of interest. So of course, under share capital, we are saying when you buy shares, you get dividends. But here you can see we are saying you get interest. You get interest. You get interest. You don't get dividends here, but you get what is known as interest. So now the company is borrowing. But of course, through borrowing, they have to pay those people who are lending money interest. So basically, when we talk about debt capital, is now raising of capital by the company by being able to borrow, by being able to borrow. So debt capital is basically the money that is basically accumulated or basically collected by the company towards its capital by being able to borrow. So you could be asking through which means or what are the ways under which the company can actually be able to know how much it can actually be able to borrow or not. So we have what is known as the borrowing powers of the company, the borrowing powers of the company. So the borrowing powers of the company will actually be outlined in what is known as the articles of association of the company. At this particular point, when I say articles of association of a company, Then basically just know I mean the rules that actually regulates the management of the internal affairs of the company. You will likely be able to know how much a company can actually be able to borrow by being able to look at its articles of association. In that particular articles of association, there will be maybe a paragraph or a clause that will likely indicate what are the borrowing powers of the company. Because you are saying under debt capital, the company is going to borrow money, but the borrowing will actually maybe be stated out in the articles of association. So the borrowing powers of the company are usually outlined in the articles of association of the company. So the articles will clearly indicate the company can be able to borrow up to this particular limit. These are through the means through which the company can actually be able to borrow, maybe by getting loans or maybe by selling debentures. So it will actually indicate to what extent can the company actually be able to borrow. So there is a limit that is actually maybe outlined in the articles of association of a company on how much it can actually be able to borrow. So any borrowing that will be made by the company, which is actually outside the articles of association, such a borrowing is usually termed as ultra vires borrowing. Ultra vires borrowing. For example, I'm saying the limits under which the company will actually be able to borrow will actually be outlined in the articles of association. So, for example, if the limit is actually set at maybe 3 billion, then the company goes and actually borrows 4 billion, which means that the company has borrowed outside the requirements of the article. So that is outside the article is actually termed as ultra vires. So if you act outside the articles, we say you're actually acting ultra vires. If you act within, we normally say you're acting inside vires. For example, if the limit is 3 billion, then you borrow 2 billion, it means that you borrowed within the requirements of the articles. So you borrowed intra vires. If you borrow beyond, for example, if you borrow 4 billion, it means that you borrowed ultra vires. The articles prohibit such a borrowing. So if you go ahead and actually borrow, it means that you are borrowing beyond the powers given out in the articles of association. So such a borrowing will be termed as being ultra vires. So one thing you have to note about ultra vires borrowing is that the company cannot be held liable for ultra vires borrowing. The company won't be held liable for ultra vires borrowing. This means that, for example, if you are a lender, the articles allow the company to borrow 3 billion, but now you go ahead and actually lend 4 billion, then the company defaults on payment of the money. If the company defaults, then you go to the court of law. In such a case, you can't hold the company liable because such a borrowing was actually ultra vires. So you could actually be asking, why is it that the company can't be held liable for ultra vires borrowing? So this one can actually basically be derived from what we learned maybe previously. So there's something that is usually known as the doctrine of constructive notice. So the doctrine of constructive notice basically states that anyone dealing with a company is presumed that he has privy knowledge to the articles of association. You've read the articles, you've understood, you know the borrowing powers. The borrowing powers stated there indicate it's supposed to borrow, the company is supposed to borrow 3 billion, but you as a lender, after even reading the articles, you go ahead and actually lend 4 billion. In such a case, inasemekana hiyo ni shauri yako kwa sababu in the articles, the company is not allowed to lend 4 billion. So why are you lending 4 billion? That is actually basically outlined by the doctrine of the constructive notice, that anyone dealing with the company is presumed that he has privy knowledge of the articles and the memorandum of association, such that if you want to lend money, if you are a clever lender, you basically have to know how much is the company actually supposed to borrow under the articles, such that if you lend ultra vires, then the company won't be held liable because it will be presumed that you had privy knowledge to the articles, and of course you lent the money maybe blindly. Maybe you didn't actually care. In such a case, if the company basically borrows money that is actually ultra vires, the company won't actually be held liable. And a lender who has lent money to the company that is actually ultra vires will actually have a hard time of actually being able to recover the money from the company. So basically, you are saying in a nutshell, the borrowing powers of the company will actually be outlined in the articles. And if the company borrows beyond the powers stated in the articles, such a borrowing will actually be ultra vires. Then number 3, if the company borrows money ultra vires, it cannot be held liable. I've given you the reason. The reason is actually derived from the doctrine of constructive notice, that anyone dealing with the company has actually read the articles and knows the borrowing powers of the company. So you could actually be asking, how will basically a person who has lent money to the company at Travayas be able to recover his money? Because you have said already the company will never be held liable. But of course, he can devise ways of how he can actually be able to basically recover his money from the company. The most obvious way you can actually be able to recover the money, this borrowing by the company must have actually been approved by the directors of the company. In such a case, you could go for the directors and not the company, because directors are the ones who actually oversee the overall affairs of the company. They are the ones who basically approved the borrowing. So they signed the borrowing forms from the bank. So in such a case, this particular lender can actually be able to recover his money by going for the director. So he can actually sue for damages or recovery of the money from the directors of the company. So that is one way he can actually be able to basically protect his money that he has lent to the company. Another way he can actually be able to do it is basically to seek a court order and stop the company from spending the money. For example, if he can ascertain that the money is actually still held in their bank account, he basically runs to the court and basically stops the company from spending the money, from actually spending the money. Another one, he can actually be able to seek a tracing order from the court. For example, if the company has already maybe spent the money on acquiring assets, you can actually seek for a tracing order from the courts and basically you can go to the company and recover the assets from the company and maybe dispose of and get his money from the company. So that is if the court actually allows. Another way you can actually be able to recover the money, number 4, which is the last one, you could actually just seek to rank as one of the creditors of the company, but he won't be given priority. He won't be given priority. Maybe he'll come as the last one to be paid, maybe even after the company has been liquidated. In such a case, he can seek to be ranked as one of the creditors, but of course the company won't give him priority in terms of payment of the creditors. Number 2, if the company has not spent the money that is still held maybe in the bank account, you can basically seek an order from the courts such that they stop the company from spending the money. Then number 3, of course, you are saying you can basically now go for the directors of the company and maybe sue them for any damages because they are the ones who basically approved the borrowing of the money. Another one is, for example, to basically seek for a court order or seek for a tracing order from the court to trace any assets acquired by his money lent to the company and recover the assets from the company and maybe sell them off to be able to get his or her money. So this is actually very key. It's something that you should actually be able to remember because what they will do in the exam, they bring a scenario and they tell you directors borrowed money. This money was not actually allowed by the articles. So what should actually hit your mind, that borrowing was Al-Travayas. Because what they tell you next is that this particular lender has gone to the company has refused to pay. So they ask you to give the legal advice to this particular lender. So what should actually hit your mind that is that particular lending was Al-Travayas. The company cannot be held liable. Those directors who actually borrowed the money are the ones who will actually be liable. But apart from them being liable, how will this particular lender be able to recover his money from the company? By being able to stop the company from spending the money. If the money is actually still in existence, maybe in the bank accounts of the company, You know, maybe sometimes students normally ask me, how will you know the money is still in the company? So maybe it could be a lender like maybe a bank. So that particular company, you know, of course, when you lend money, it's most obvious that the company has an account with you as a lender, as a bank. So you as a bank, you can know how much money is actually in the account of that particular client or that particular borrower has borrowed the money. So that's how you can actually easily maybe determine if the money is still there. Because you can easily monitor the transaction. Since you lent the money, have they transferred it to another person? So you can easily monitor. For example, if you're actually maybe a lender like a bank. But for example, if it's maybe a circle, it will be very difficult because maybe they just come and collect the money, they now go and bank somewhere else. So you cannot monitor the transactions. It could actually be very difficult to know whether the money is actually still in the existence of the company. So if you get such a scenario, then of course the first thing that should actually hit your mind is that under borrowing powers, the company cannot be held liable for Al-Travayas borrowing. Maybe the directors of the company can be held liable. And what is Al-Travayas borrowing is if the company borrows beyond the powers outlined in the articles of association. articles of association. So that's all you need to know about the borrowing powers of the company, the borrowing powers of the company. So of course, you are saying under debt capital, the company is trying to borrow, and I've told you the most obvious instrument they could use is basically by a sale of what is known as debentures. So they could sell debentures. So I've already told you is that debenture is basically just a document that will authenticate or rapidly indicate that the company is indebted to you. And the obligation under this particular debenture is for the company to be able to pay you the principal amount and the interest. So here, your key interest in the company, you as an investor, will likely for you to be able to get interest. But of course, under shares, you are saying you get dividends. You get dividends. You get dividends. So there are different types of debentures. And just the same way, like under share capital, they are basically just described by their name. For example, you can have a debenture known as a secured debenture. A secured debenture. A secured debenture is a debenture, of course, under which the arrangement is that you lend money to the company, but this particular money must be secured. How will it be secured? You basically look for an asset in the company as a security. And secured debenture is the opposite. You just lend money. If the company fails to pay you, you won't go for any asset in the company as a security. As a security. So that is what we mean by secured and unsecured. We have another one, redeemable and irredeemable. What we mean by redeemable debenture is just almost like the same scenario of redeemable preference shares. At a particular point, these particular debentures will revert back to the company, maybe after a period of like maybe 2 years. Then, of course, you'll collect all your principal amount and interest from the company. The company will redeem the debentures. Will just redeem the debentures maybe after a particular period of time. So, for example, they could agree the debentures will actually be redeemed after 3 years. This means at the end of the third year, this particular debentures you acquired from the company will revert back to the company. Once they revert back to the company, because you are seeing the obligation under debentures, is basically for the company to be able to pay the principal amount and interest. So this means that at the end of the third year, the principal amount will likely be due. So all the interest and the principal amount must be paid at the end of the third year. So that's when basically it will be like a form of basically the debentures reverting back to the company and you being able to get all the principal amount and the interest that is due after the end of the three years. Then you have another one that is known as irredeemable. Now this one is not redeemed. The company cannot basically, like for example, like buy it back from you. It basically means that you'll be a debenture holder in the company for the lifetime of the company. It won't be redeemed at the end of any period. You'll just enjoy this particular interest from the company for the lifetime of the company. Until when the company is liquidated, that's when you actually get the principal amount. It is irredeemable. It can't be redeemed by the company. So this one will actually exist for the lifetime of the company, unless it is liquidated. That's when unawezaenda sasa uanze kudai your principal amount. But redeemable, utadai principal amount at the end of the stipulated period under that particular debenture, when it's likely supposed to be redeemed. At the end of that particular period, all the principal amount and the interest amount from the company will actually fall due. The company must actually pay all these particular amounts. But if it is actually irredeemable, it means that what you will basically enjoy for the lifetime of the company will actually be interest. Unless the company is liquidated, its life is coming to an end, that's when you actually claim for your principal amount. So that is an irredeemable. It can't be redeemed. Irredeemable debenture. It is actually an irredeemable debenture. It is actually an irredeemable debenture. So I don't know if go up to that particular point. There's a question. You can ask a question. You can ask a question. Seems you guys are actually okay. So I've already given you 4 types of debentures. So I've told you can have secured, you can have unsecured, and I've told you basically the description of the debenture just comes out of how the debenture is actually named. Secured, there's a security in the company. You as a lender, you give money to the company, but of course there's an assurance. If the company fails to pay you this particular principal amount, you can run for a security. Maybe it's a motor vehicle in the company. So it has actually been done. What you're going to see what is known as charging. What it means, you've charged or you've used the asset of the company as a security to lend money to the company. So you charge maybe a motor vehicle, maybe you charge the land of the company. In such a case, if they fail to pay you, go for the land and sell it off, you recover your principal amount from the company. Maybe the company is defaulting on payment of interest. So there's a security there that you can actually go for. Then there's another one that can actually be termed as being bearer debenture. Bearer debenture. Bearer debenture. This one, we sometimes say it is like a negotiable instrument. This is basically where now you can actually transfer your interest in the company to another party, such that the bearer can actually be able to present to the company and tell them, I want the interest and the principal amount under this debenture. This means that, for example, I can actually easily maybe give it to Helen, and Helen arrives at the office of the company and tells them, I want all the principal amount and interest due on this debenture. I want you to pay me and not maybe the holder of the debenture. So there's a provision for the debenture holder to be able to transfer the interest to another party, such that the bearer of it can present to the company and claim for the principal amount and interest. So it is known as a bearer debenture. The bearer can actually be able to present it to the company and claim for the principal and interest. So in such a way, it actually acts as a negotiable instrument that can act. It means that you can actually always transfer your interest under this particular debenture to another party. So maybe there's someone you're actually owing money. So you tell him, I can't actually be able to have the money right now, but of course I have a debenture here, or I have an interest in a company that I lent to money. You can actually just basically take this particular debenture they gave to me, you present it, they give you the money. So as he goes, he will actually become the bearer of the debenture. It is known as a bearer debenture. Then debentures can actually also be maybe described as registered debenture. So basically what it means that by registered debenture, it basically has all the formal details to do with the holder of the debenture. So it's registered in his name. It has the details of this particular person who has actually acquired the debentures. So it will likely be termed as being a registered debenture. It will likely be termed as being a registered debenture. Then you have another one that you can actually maybe call convertible debenture. Convertible debenture. Now this one can be converted just from the word convertible. You can convert the interest from being a debenture to being shares. You actually are a debenture holder in a company, but you see that this company is struggling to pay interest. It's just struggling to pay interest. You know what you must actually understand here under debt capital, this particular interest is mandatory for the company to pay whether the company is making profits or not. You know, under dividends, you are saying under share capital, dividends will only be paid out of distributable profits. This means that dividends will only be paid if the company makes profits. But under interest, it doesn't matter. Whether the company has made a loss or not, those persons who lent money to the company are actually claiming their interest. So it means that, for example, if you see that the company is struggling to pay me interest, and basically you have a convertible debenture, so you can convert your interest in the company. You tell them, I gave you guys 10 million, but I can see you're actually struggling to pay interest on the 10 million. Why don't you guys just convert this particular debentures into paid shares? So they just take your principal amount of 10 million shillings, they look for equivalent amount of shares in the company, they give you the shares. In such a case, it won't be mandatory for the company to pay you dividends because you will have reduced the burden for the company. It won't now be forced to pay you interest every time and then, now and then, because you can now actually be able to convert your interest in the company from being a debenture and now actually becoming shares. And of course, under shares, what you are claiming from the company is dividends. Dividends can only be paid out of distributable profits. If they are not distributable profits, then you come out empty-handed. In such a case, you will reduce the burden for the company. So a convertible debenture is a debenture that you can actually basically convert your interest in the company from being a debenture to just actually maybe being shares or any other interest in the company. So it will be termed as being a convertible debenture. It can be termed as being a convertible debenture. Then the other thing you have to basically understand here is basically for you to actually to be able to know what is the difference between debentures and shares. So maybe this one you can tell me, because I've mentioned several of them since we started. You can tell me a few, like maybe 3 or 4. What is the difference between debentures and shares? Debentures and shares, I've mentioned several of them since we started. So maybe you can just mention them there in the chat so that I see if you guys are actually very keen with what you are learning. What is the difference between debentures and shares? I can see Edward here says debentures earn interest. Debentures earn interest while shares earn dividends. That's very correct. That's brilliant. That's very brilliant. Any other person? I've mentioned several of them since we started. I can see Ahmed says shares cannot be issued at a discount, while debentures can be issued at a discount. So that's true. I can see Edward says interest on debentures must be paid within a specified period, while dividends on shares is only paid when declared, when profits are actually declared. So that's true. Any other person who can actually try? I can see Samson says shares are part ownership, have part ownership in the company by the shareholders, while debenture is a document used by the company to raise its capital. I can see Ellen says a shareholder is a member of a company, while a debenture holder is not a member. What you can actually say, best actually say maybe a debenture holder is a creditor of the company. A debenture holder is a creditor of the company. So a shareholder is a member of a company, while a debenture holder is basically a creditor, because I'm telling there's the aspect of lending money by an investor. So he becomes a creditor of the company. He becomes a creditor of the company. Shares are units of a capital. I can see Edward says shares are units of capital. Debentures are units of a loan. So I see you guys are actually very brilliant. So basically there are few differences between shares, or what you're supposed to discover about shares, and debentures, about shares and debentures. So basically the holders of shares become part owners of the company. So when you buy shares in a company, you become like an owner of the company. You become a shareholder in the company. You become a part owner of the company. When you buy debentures in a company, you become a creditor of the company. You become a creditor of the company. Another thing is that it's the most quite obvious. You basically earn interest on debentures. You get dividends on basically shares. But further than that, you have to know that interest on debentures is payable whether the company has made profits or not. Dividends will actually only be payable if the company has actually been able to make profits. So if the company is actually able to make profits, that's when it can actually be able to maybe pay the dividends. Another thing you have to note is, for example, if the company is liquidated, debenture holders will be given priority over shareholders because shareholders are actually part owners, so they are usually given the last priority. They only benefit from the revenues of the company after liquidation of the company. So during liquidation, when the life of the company is to come to an end, now they are paying all the liabilities of the company. They basically consider debenture holders first before they go to maybe the shareholders of the company. So holders of debentures are usually given priority on liquidation of the company than maybe the shareholders or the holders of shares in a company because they are part owners of the company. And in fact, part of their contributions will actually be utilized either to pay the debenture holders or actually creditors of the company. Then another thing is that debentures may be issued at a discount, but issue of shares at a discount is prohibited. It's not actually really allowed under the law. And of course, I clearly mentioned this one is, for example, if you issue shares at a discount, it's just the same aspect we are talking about maintenance of share capital. You won't be maintaining the share capital of the company. If you issue shares at a discount, it means that the share capital you are reporting in the books is not actually true because you've issued the shares at a lower price. But of course, they said you could look for other routes on how you can actually be able to issue shares at a discount. If you issue shares at a discount, you basically look for the amount to replace with the discount, maybe by getting the money out of share premium. For example, if you issue shares at a price that is basically higher, you are getting higher than what is actually required to be reported in the books. So that amount will be maintained in the share premium account. You could get money from the share premium account to cover for the discount. So issue of shares at a discount is actually prohibited, but issue of debentures at a discount is actually allowed. It's actually allowed. Then interest is paid on basically debentures, dividends is paid on basically this shares is paid on shares. It's actually paid on shares. So maybe you could actually also ask, what are the similarities between shares and debentures? How similar are they? So how do you think they're actually similar? So there are most obvious things that you can actually be able to note about debentures and shares. How similar are they? How similar are these two? Apart from the distinctions we talked about, how similar are shares and debentures? In what way are they each similar in a company? I can see Edward, that's the most obvious. So they are both a means through which the company is actually able to raise its finance or maybe raise its money to maybe finance its activities. So I can see Edward says both are finances of the company. Both are finances of the company. Any other thing you can actually be able to know. So they are both means of raising capital in a company. Under debt capital, if you use debt capital, basically sell debentures, you'll be able to raise capital under debt capital. If you sell shares under share capital, you'll be able to raise capital under share capital. So there are both ways of raising capital in a company. So another way, another difference you can actually be able to think about. Another thing you can actually be able to say is that both of them are usually issued in classes. Because you've seen the different classes or types of debentures. So you could have basically a class of debentures being categorized as being bearer debentures. Also under shares, we saw you can have different classes. For example, you can have preference shares. They have different rights in the company. So both of them can be issued in classes. So shares and debentures can be issued in classes or different types. They can be put together in a class be issued such that they have similar rights in the company. For example, those who are actually under convertible debentures, they have a right to be able to convert the debentures. So that is their class. When you talk about shares, for example, you could be having, for example, preference shares. They have a right to get dividends before any other classes. So both of them can be issued in series or maybe different classes. So that is another similarity. And what else can you actually be able to talk about? Another thing is that when I talked about a prospectus, I might not have actually mentioned, but of course, one thing you have to note about a prospectus can be issued in both scenarios, whereby the company wants to sell shares or maybe wants to sell debentures. So both of them can be issued via prospectus. So a prospectus, when you are defining it, it's actually okay to say it's basically any document or basically any advertisement issued to the members of the public to be able to purchase into the shares or debentures of the company. So both of them, debentures and shares, can actually be issued through a prospectus being issued by the company. The other thing you have to note also, both of them can be redeemed. Remember, we've learned about can be redeemed or can be redeemable. We've learned about redeemable preference shares. So here also you've seen I've mentioned a class known as redeemable debentures. So both of them can actually be redeemed. So that is a similarity you can just actually mention. So they can actually both be redeemed. So they can both be redeemed. Then the last one, they are both long-term means of raising. So they are usually long-term in nature. Mostly you find that, for example, the lender of money lends it for a very long period of time. This particular share capital that has been raised through each sale of shares will actually exist in the company for a very long period of time. So they are long-term means, or they are both long-term means of raising the capital of the company. They are both long-term means of raising the capital of the company. So I think you have your past paper, you can actually be able to look at this particular question. So they asked about this. You can look at May 2019, question 2B, Roman 2. May 2019, question 2B, Roman 2. So someone has not muted himself. Let me just mute them. So May 2019, question 2B, Roman 2. It says, summarize three differences between debentures and shares. Summarize three differences between debentures and shares. So that was tested in May 2019. So that is what we've just looked at. A shareholder is a part owner of the company. The debenture holder is a creditor. Interest is paid on debentures. Dividends is paid on shares. Debenture holders or holders of debentures will be given priority on liquidation of the company. So they'll be paid first before the part owners or maybe the shareholders of the company. Then interest on debentures is mandatory to be paid whether the company has made profits or not. Dividends is actually it depends on availability of profits or at the discretion of the directors of the company. So maybe this time they'll ask you what are the similarities? What are the similarities of debentures? They are just what you just mentioned a while ago. So I want us to look at, because that's all about how you can describe debentures, how you can describe the debentures. Alternatively, they could ask you what are the characteristics of debentures. So you could easily get them from what we've just been discussing. So the holders of debentures are actually the creditors of the company. So debentures can actually be issued by a prospectus. They just want to describe generally what is actually a debenture or how can it actually be described in the context of a company, in the context of a company, in the context of a company. So under the topic of membership, you learned about something known as the register of debenture, the register of members. So here we also have a register of debenture holders, basically just an enlisting of all the debenture holders of the company. And it should just contain a description of who are the debenture holders of the company. That's why we have debenture holders register. So a debenture holders register has to be maintained in the company. A debenture holders register has to be maintained in the company. And the most obvious thing you could be asked, what are the contents? What are the contents of a register of debenture holders? What are the contents of a register of debenture holders? So these are requirements under the Companies Act that the company basically maintains a register of the debenture holders of the company. So the contents basically contain the name and address of the debenture holder, the date when he became a debenture holder, so the number of debentures that are actually being held by this particular debenture holder, and then of course maybe what is the class of the debentures that are actually being held by this particular debenture holder, and in case there are actually any assets charged in the company, they'll actually also describe that this particular debenture holder has actually charged a particular asset in the company, or a particular asset has been used as a security to basically secure the debentures of this particular holder. So of course, it's just generally a description of the debentures given to that particular debenture holder and the details of the debenture holder, the name and address of the debenture holder, the date when he became a debenture holder or when he exited also from being a debenture holder of the company, when he exited from being a debenture holder of the company, the class of debentures being held by the debenture holder. Then of course, if the debenture holders are actually more than 50, then they'll maintain what is known as an index of debenture holders. So they maintain an index of debenture holders. That's the same case like under members. If the members are actually more than 50, so this particular enlisting of the debentures will be maintained in an index. That's if the debenture holders are more than 50, But of course, the details or the content of the index won't actually be very different with the normal register, because the only distinction with the normal register is that this particular index will be kept like in a card form. So each and every card will be basically be detailing the details of the debenture holder. It will basically be maintained in a card form, such that each and every debenture holder has his own card. This particular card is basically containing the details of the debenture holder. So if there are more than 50, then the company will be required to keep what is known as an index of debenture holders. But generally, the contents of the index of debenture holders will just be the same as those of the normal register. The only difference is that this one is like in a card form, whereby each debenture holder has like his own card, but all the details to do with the register of debenture will be captured on the card. That card will clearly indicate what is the name and address of the debenture holders, what are the number of debentures involved in that particular company, and which class. What is basically, maybe there's like any charging of assets, which assets have actually been charged. So the date when he actually became a debenture holder in the company, or when he actually exited from being a debenture holder in the company. When he actually exited from being a debenture holder in the company. The amounts paid for the debentures, those will actually be part of the contents of the register of debenture holders. The contents of the register of debenture holders. So we can look at another key aspect. So of course you've seen generally under debt capital the company is borrowing, but now there's actually now the aspect of charges. The aspect of charges. So we can have two kinds of charges. We can have a floating charge, then we can have a fixed charge. So when the company basically borrows money, it will actually go ahead and actually basically, or the assets of the company will actually be charged by the lenders of the money. It's just like a scenario can actually give you as an individual, you go to the bank to get a loan, they'll tell you to give an asset as a security. So it's just the same aspect like in the company, when it's actually basically going to borrow money, because under debt capital is actually borrowing, then of course the assets of the company might sometimes actually be charged. So the assets can actually be charged, such that the assets can be used as a security. It can either be motor vehicles of the company, it can be land of the company, it can be buildings of the company. So long as it's an asset that can actually be charged and has a title, then of course that asset can be basically be charged, such that the company can use it as a security to basically get money from the lenders out there, or basically those who actually are acquiring debentures in the company. So they give money to the company, but of course they tell the company to give a security, such that if the company defaults on payment of its obligation, but of course, since of course you've seen the obligation is usually to pay principal plus the interest. So if the company basically defaults on any of these particular obligations of paying the principal and interest amount, then the company, or basically the lender, can of course come to the company and basically secure his assets or take over the assets that was used as a security and maybe sell it off. So he has an option of actually basically selling it off, basically just collecting it like a motor vehicle and sell it off. Or basically sometimes you can maybe appoint a receiver. So a receiver will actually basically come in and actually manage the affairs of the company. But of course you'll see under debentures, just after charges, there's usually an agreement or basically something known as a debenture trust deed. So under that particular debenture trust deed, the debenture holder will be able to derive some of the rights. For example, this particular right of appointing a receiver. So this is basically where now the business is actually unable to pay interest. But you as a lender, you're actually suffering. You're not actually able to get your money from the company. So under the agreement, you're actually allowed, when you lend the money, that you can appoint a receiver, basically someone to step into the company and take over the management of the affairs of the company, such that you can actually be able to manage it and maybe the company starts to be more profitable. In such a case, you have such an allowance, you can appoint a receiver to come and manage the company, or another alternative the receiver will actually do, will come in and actually seize all the assets for your interest and maybe sell them on your behalf, then get the money and actually pay you the money that was actually owed to you by the company. So these particular remedies will actually be able to see them mostly will actually be outlined under what is known as a debenture trust deed. So of course there are two ways of how assets of the company can actually be charged or can be used as a security under borrowing of money by use of debentures, or basically by selling out debentures. So the assets can be used as a security maybe through what is known as a floating charge or maybe a fixed charge. So you could be asking, what is the difference between a floating charge and what is actually now a fixed charge? So a fixed charge is just fixed. Just the way it is being described is fixed. A floating charge is floating. It's actually floating. It's neither here or there. It's not on a specific asset. Only until there's an occurrence of an event that will actually make it to settle on a specific asset. So when you talk about a floating charge, so this one normally confuses students. So a floating charge is a charge that is not on a specific asset. So until maybe there's an occurrence of an event, that's when it actually settles on that particular asset. Maybe under the agreement is that, for example, if you default, that's basically when you can now come for the asset. But you can use the asset in whatever you want. You can sell it off, buy another one. So the lender won't actually concern himself with such. But of course, when you actually default, that's when they basically now come specifically for that asset. In such a case, we say that asset has actually been charged, but now that particular charge is just floating over the asset. It's not really on that particular specific asset. What you realize that the main difference between this particular floating charge and a fixed charge, under a fixed charge, the company won't actually be able to dispose of the asset without consulting the debenture holders or the lenders. Thus now the asset is actually the charge is actually very fixed. For example, if it is actually a motor vehicle or a Mercedes Benz, it basically means that before the company can actually acquire another one to replace that one, then of course they have to consult the debenture holders under a fixed charge, because the charge is actually on a specific asset. But now under a floating charge, is not really on a specific asset. It just hovers, this particular charge hovers over the asset until maybe there's an occurrence of an event that basically now forces this particular charge to settle on the specific asset. The most obvious one I'm telling you is, for example, if the company defaults on payment. Now we say that particular charge has actually now settled on a specific asset. That aspect of basically settling on a specific asset will actually make the charge no longer to be a floating charge, but now it will convert itself to being a fixed charge, because now it is on a fixed asset or a fixed charge in the company, because you'll specifically come for that asset as a lender and maybe sell it off. But of course, you are saying if the asset is actually under a floating charge, then you as a borrower, maybe as a company, you can use the asset in whatever you want without even consulting the lenders or the debenture holders who have basically lent money to the company. So the aspect of basically a floating charge settling into becoming a fixed charge on a specific asset is actually known as crystallization of a charge. Crystallization of a charge. So I know the question is, how does it actually settle? I've told you a floating charge is a charge that basically hovers over an asset, and the key point in that particular definition, until an occurrence of an event. So that aspect of an occurrence of an event is actually very important, because before that particular occurrence of the event actually occurs, it just still remains as a floating charge. And it is floating in this way because it is not on a specific asset. The company can do whatever way with the asset it actually wants to do, maybe sell it off, even use it in the course of business without even consulting the lenders. But that particular point basically now distinguishes a floating charge from a fixed charge, such that under fixed charge is on a specific asset. You won't actually be able to use the asset in whatever way you want unless you consult the debenture holders under the fixed charge. But then, of course, you are saying that occurrence of an event, when it actually happens, this particular charge will no longer be a floating charge. It will convert itself and become actually what is known as a fixed charge, because it will now be on a specific asset. And this means that that occurrence of an event will actually make the lender basically come for the asset. That aspect of coming for the asset will actually basically mean now is coming specifically for the asset. So it will no longer be a floating charge, it will now be a fixed charge. So, but basically, if under the agreement, it basically means that you can use the assets whatever you want without consulting the lender, then that particular kind of a charge will be described as actually being a floating charge. But it floats until an occurrence of an event. So we'll see other events that can actually make this particular floating charge to settle or maybe crystallize. So when you talk about crystallization of a charge, it basically means that it is actually the aspect of a floating charge turning from being a floating charge and actually now becoming a fixed charge. How can it crystallize? Under occurrence of certain events. The most obvious one is, for example, if you default on payment of interest. Now the lender will basically take a step to be able to secure his asset in the company. You'll secure it in a way that you specifically come for the asset. So the charge will no longer be a floating charge, but now it will actually be a fixed charge. So this particular floating charge, just from what I'm trying to describe, it has several disadvantages to the lender. Because since you are saying under floating charge, you can just use the assets in whatever way you want. It means that when this particular lender will come actually basically to recover his money from the company, maybe the assets would have actually depreciated. Would have actually depreciated. So it basically means that he won't actually get value from this particular asset, even if he sells off to recover his money from the company. So that is a major disadvantage of a floating charge. But under a fixed charge, of course, we are saying he has to consult the lenders before he actually basically decides to use the assets in whatever way he actually wants. So what are the events, or which occurrence or which events can actually make this particular floating charge to crystallize and now actually become specific and settle on a specific asset and turn into a fixed charge? So one of them, which is actually very key, is, for example, if the company actually starts to undergo liquidation. So liquidation of the company is one of the events that can actually make a floating charge to crystallize and become a fixed charge. How does it actually happen? Because if the company is going to be liquidated, if you are a lender of money to a company, then for you to be able to secure your money in the company, you basically run for the asset. Because after liquidation, the life of the company won't actually exist. So now for you to be able to secure it, if you hear the company is being liquidated, then obviously you basically run to the company and say, I had actually charged this particular asset under a floating charge. I want it to be sold so that I recover my money from the company. So liquidation of the company is one of the key events that can actually make a floating charge crystallize and actually become a fixed charge. So if it was a motor vehicle, you will run for it. So that you basically maybe take it, sell it off, recover your money before the company actually goes under. So you can have liquidation of the company. Number two is, for example, if under the agreement of lending of the money, the company allowed for the debenture holder or the lender to appoint someone known as a receiver, which I've just been saying a while ago. If a receiver is appointed by the debenture holders, mostly the receiver will actually be appointed by the debenture holders. For example, if the company is defaulting on payment of interest, so they are not actually able to pay the interest, or maybe they are defaulted to pay the principal amount when it's actually falls due. So if the agreement under the lending or maybe under the debenture trust it allows for the debenture holders to appoint a receiver, the moment they appoint a receiver, all the floating charges that were actually under those particular debenture holders will automatically turn into fixed charges, because they will appoint a receiver just to come into the company and recover their assets on their behalf and sell them off and give them their money. So these particular floating charges will no longer be floating charges, but they likely become now fixed charges. So if they appoint a receiver to come in, maybe manage the company or maybe recover their assets on their behalf, in such a case, that particular occurrence of an event, appointment of a receiver, will actually make the floating charge crystallize and actually become a fixed charge, Another reason that could actually make this particular floating charge to crystallize, or maybe someone to basically now just want to take his assets from the company, is, for example, if the company is consistently making losses. It has not been profitable for a very long period of time. So those are actually signs that the company is actually maybe going to go under. So basically now you instruct the company you want your money or you want to withdraw as a debenture holder, and they basically give you your money. If they are not actually able to give you your money, you basically go for your security that will actually under a floating charge. So if you go for that particular security, that aspect of going for it will basically turn it from being a floating charge and it will actually become a fixed charge. So if the company is consistently making losses and there are no chances it will actually become profitable, it means that you won't actually be able to the company won't actually be able to meet its obligations in terms of actually being able to pay interest on the debentures. So that could actually be a sign to give you as a lender, you are supposed to go for your asset and maybe sell it off to recover your money. So if that particular charge was actually under a floating charge, it will no longer be a floating charge, but now it will turn into being a fixed charge. So another one that we normally talk of, number 4. So of course, number 1, I've told you liquidation of the company. The life of the company is coming to an end. Number 2, you appoint a receiver as a lender or a debenture holder. That aspect of appointment of a receiver will actually make 2 things to happen. That receiver will come into the company and all the directors will lose their positions. He will take over the management of the affairs of the company. Then number 2, what he can actually do, he could actually maybe come in to recover that particular asset on your behalf, just to secure it as a receiver. Then he sells it on your behalf, he gets the money and actually gives you the money from the company. Then number 3, we are saying, of course, if the company is consistently making losses and maybe there are no chances, it will become very profitable. So like for the last 3 years, they have been making losses. So you see signs here, if I don't go for my security, I lend money to this company. So they are likely to start defaulting maybe in the near future, or already they have started defaulting. In such a case, it means that you can actually basically go for your asset in the company. So if that particular asset you have given them the liberty to just use it in whatever way they want, because that's what you are seeing will happen under floating charge. If you go for it specifically, now you want it, you want to take it and sell it. That charge will now actually turn into now being on a specific asset, which will now be a fixed charge. Then you can actually also talk about, for example, if there is a crystallization of another charge in the company that actually makes the company to be liquidated. So how can a crystallization of a charge actually make a company to be liquidated? For example, under this aspect I'm telling you, a receiver will actually be appointed. You know, when a receiver is actually appointed, it's just basically coming in. It's mostly appointed in a scenario whereby the company is not actually maybe meeting its obligations in terms of maybe payment of loans. So therefore, a lender or a creditor or a debenture holder appoints a receiver. So the receiver, what he'll actually do, he'll come in, try to manage the business. If he manages the business and actually sees that there are no chances that the life of this company will actually maybe come back to track, such that it will actually maybe start becoming profitable to pay maybe loans or maybe interest. What he will do, this particular receiver, he will recommend that the company be liquidated. Just like what has actually happened to Mumias Sugar. If you see, the receiver at Mumias Sugar was actually appointed by Kenya Commercial Bank. So it means that Kenya Commercial Bank was a lender to Mumias Sugar. Mumias Sugar failed to basically meet its obligations in terms of payment of loans to Kenya Commercial Bank. So what were the steps that Kenya Commercial Bank would have actually taken? Just like the other normal lender we are discussing here, Kenya Commercial Bank as a lender went ahead and actually appointed a receiver to take over the operations of Mumias Sugar. If this particular receiver appointed by KCB basically tries to manage it and basically sees that Mumias Sugar won't actually come back to life, he'll basically give a report maybe at the end of the year and actually state that the operations at Mumias Sugar won't actually come back on track, or maybe it won't come back to being profitable. He will recommend the life of the company comes to an end. So let's assume KCB was actually one of the debenture holders at Mumias Sugar. And of course, there were other debenture holders in the company, apart from Mumias Sugar. So Mumias Sugar as a debenture holder has basically appointed a receiver. This receiver recommends at the end of the year that this company be liquidated. And of course, previously, we've already seen under point number 1, if the company is liquidated, of course, all the other floating charges will actually basically crystallize and become fixed charges. So if there's a specific floating charge, basically there's a crystallization of floating charge, another floating charge in the company that makes the life of the company come to an end, all the other floating charges will crystallize. So all the other debenture holders were actually under floating charge at Mumias Sugar that has actually basically been liquidated as a result of basically one of the debenture holder, KCB, being able to appoint a receiver. All the other floating charges will basically crystallize. So number 4 point that you can actually be able to say is if there is a crystallization of a floating charge that makes or basically leads to the life of the company coming to an end. It will make all the other floating charges, because the life of the company is coming to an end, then basically all the other floating charges will actually crystallize and actually become fixed charges. So crystallization of any floating charge in the company that makes the life of the company to come to an end will actually make a floating charge to crystallize and now settle on a specific asset, that turning it into being a fixed charge and no longer a floating charge. So maybe the examiner could ask you, what are the events that can actually make a floating charge to crystallize in a company? So if they ask you for such, Then of course, just remember what you've just been discussing. I want you to look at this particular question. It's May 2017, question 4C. It's May 2017, question 4C. Alternatively, you could look at September 2015, question 5A is just the same question. September 2015, question 5A. It says, discuss 3 events when a floating charge might crystallize. So that is September 2015. Then May 2017, question 4C, Roman 2, explain 3 instances when a floating charge is deemed to crystallize. When a floating charge is deemed to crystallize. So the first thing you should actually basically be able to understand what is a floating charge. So that I've already described. I've said a floating charge. First of all, you have to understand the aspect of charges. When you talk about a charge, it basically means that it's an asset in the company that has been used as a security to basically secure the borrowing of the money by the company. So these charges we are seeing can actually be described in 2 ways. We can have floating charges and we can have fixed charges. So a floating charge is basically a charge that is basically hovering over an asset. And the key point in that particular definition, I've told you, it hovers until an occurrence of an event. Those events are just the ones you've just been describing here, liquidation. For example, if liquidation occurs, it basically make this particular floating charge to basically crystallize and actually become a fixed charge. So a floating charge is basically a charge that hovers over an asset of a company until an occurrence of an event that makes it to settle on that particular specific asset or settle on a specific asset. That aspect of settling on a specific asset is known as crystallization. And once it crystallizes or once it settles on a specific asset, it will no longer be a floating charge. It will now turn into being a fixed charge. So how do you describe a fixed charge? A fixed charge is a charge on a specific asset of a company, on a specific asset of a company. So that particular question, they're asking the events that can actually make a floating charge to crystallize and become a fixed charge. They're just the ones you've actually just been describing. For example, if the company is put into liquidation, then if basically a receiver is appointed by the debenture holders, or maybe the debenture holders take any step to recover their money from the company by appointing a receiver. Once the receiver is actually appointed, automatically the floating charge will settle and become a fixed charge. Then if the company ceases to be a going concern, or basically there are chances, if you look at how the company is basically operating, it won't exist for the foreseeable future. So the going concern is doubtful. For example, it's making consistently making losses, or it's not making profits. Then such could be signs that the going concern of the company is doubtful. Then crystallization of another charge that makes the life of the company to come to an end could be another point. Could be another point. Could be another point. Or maybe you could give another one that is actually very direct. Basically, the debenture holders give a notice to the company. They don't want their floating charges to be floating charges. They convert them into fixed charges. So they could notify the company that all floating charges under their name be converted into fixed charges. So through a notice by the debenture holders to the company that all floating charges under their name be converted into fixed charges. be converted into fixed charges. Be converted into fixed charges. So that is all about crystallization of a charge. So we've got in the aspects. What is crystallization of a charge? So maybe you can delve deeper into a floating charge. So this particular floating charge is that it has several disadvantages, but of course there are other advantages. The most obvious advantage I've mentioned to you is that the company is able to use the asset in whatever way it wants without even consulting the debenture holders. Then another thing you have to discover about floating charges is that sometimes the company can create, for example, if it is a motor vehicle, you have a motor vehicle under a floating charge, it can subsequently create a fixed charge on the same motor vehicle. But what you will realize that this particular fixed charge on the same motor vehicle will be given priority over the floating charge. So it means that, for example, if you have debenture holder A, who has actually basically charged the motor vehicle under a floating charge, then another debenture holder comes in, maybe the coming month, debenture holder B, he charges the same motor vehicle under a fixed charge. The debenture holder B, who came in later and charged the same asset under a fixed charge, will be given priority on payment. You know, this aspect of priority on payment confuses students. It basically means that if, for example, these particular debenture holders take steps to recover their money from the company, and it reaches a point they have to sell their assets to recover their money, it means that the debenture holder under the fixed charge will be basically be paid first out of the money that is basically gotten by selling off the motor vehicle. So this basically gives you the point that any asset under a floating charge, there can be subsequent fixed charges that can be created over the same asset, but these particular fixed charges will rank in priority. So they rank in priority. How do they rank in priority? It basically means that the debenture holder who is actually under a fixed charge, if the motor vehicle is actually sold, even if this particular fixed charge was created later, maybe even after a month, if a floating charge was created on the same asset, the debenture holder who is actually under a fixed charge will be given priority on payments. For example, if this particular motor vehicle is sold and they realize, for example, 5 million, and this one, for example, owed, for example, 4 million, this one, for example, owed, for example, 2 million. So this particular debenture holder, so the debenture holder under a fixed charge will be paid first his 4 million before they can actually pay this one under a floating charge. So this gives you an idea that all fixed charges will actually always rank in priority to floating charges. So that is what you're supposed to actually note at this particular point. So subsequently, other charges can be created on an asset under a floating charge that might rank in priority. Like, for example, fixed charges. So fixed charges can be basically be created on the same asset under a floating charge, and the fixed charges will actually rank in priority. Then another thing you have to note about floating charge is, of course, you say the company can use the assets in whatever it actually wants. Another thing is that a landlord seeking for district over rent will actually be given priority over a floating charge. So, for example, in this case, we have, for example, you've been able to lease a land, You're using the land maybe to store your tractors. So maybe you are a constructor. You store your machinery there. So in this particular case, there are machines here. There are machines, there are tractors. So this land you actually just list. So this is basically under lease, there's a relationship between a landlord and a tenant. So in this case, you are the tenant here in this land. But of course, these particular machines that are actually here, you actually also borrowed a loan from the bank. You as a tenant, you've kept your assets, so you have a relationship under lease with the landlord. But these machines, you actually also use the machines to basically acquire a loan from the bank. So you as a company, you basically got a loan from the bank. So this particular bank has actually been able to charge these particular machines of yours under a floating charge. And remember, you still store them on the land that you've actually leased from the landlord. Then it reaches a point you're not actually able to pay this particular landlord. It's actually maybe destroying you, basically destroying you for rent, because it could actually stop you from accessing these premises until you're actually able maybe to pay off his money. But remember, there's another party who has an interest over the machines restrained on this particular land. So this particular party who is actually under a floating charge or has charged these particular machines under a floating charge will basically not be given priority to the landlord, because what the landlord will likely do will take over their assets and sell them off. So this one will likely lose. The one who was actually under a floating charge, or the bank that lent you money under a floating charge, will likely lose and would be given priority. The landlord in this case, who is restraining your machines, will be given priority such that he can actually be able to recover them first, sell them off, and recover his money in terms of rent. So the bank will actually end up losing in such a case. So if basically there are assets that are basically maybe charged under a floating charge, and you have a landlord seeking for distress over rent, like in what I've just described, the landlord will be given priority over basically that particular lender under a floating charge, over that particular lender under a floating charge. So those are some of the disadvantages. Maybe this particular floating charge, you can see a landlord is given priority, so that is a disadvantage. The company is actually able to use the asset in a way it wants, so that is a disadvantage to the lender. Other charges can be created over the same asset, like fixed charges that can rank in priority, even if they are created subsequently. In such a case, that is actually a disadvantage to a lender under a floating charge. So it has several disadvantages, and it's not actually preferable for basically a lender or a debenture holder to charge the assets of the company under a floating charge. So maybe a fixed charge would likely be very secure than maybe a floating charge. So I think today we can actually end there. I don't want to give you more information or a lot of information about charges, but we'll basically wind up with charges and look at something known as a debenture trust deeds and a floating charge. Then I can also look at ranking or priority of charges. That's what I've been trying to describe. How do you prioritize charges? So I think we can end there today. So we'll actually be able to wind up this particular topic in our next session. Then basically let's see what we can actually be able to do next. But if you have a question, you can just ask it. But I'll share the notes. I'll share the notes on debt capital. So it's a topic you need to be very keen with it, because it's one of the areas most students actually like forgetting about most of these aspects about crystallization. That topic is very hard. I don't want to read it, but you just need to read it consistently. You'll actually be able to understand most of these things. So I think you can end there today. If you have a question, you can actually ask. But of course we'll see how we'll wind up this topic in our next class. So those who need the notes, you can actually talk to me. Just chat me and be able to give you the notes on debt capital.